At the beginning of this lecture that we explore in the first part of this video, Rudolf Steiner indicated that only a brief survey of the rites and orders of Freemasonry could be given, since the subject is vast and surrounded by many secondary details, but that its essential foundation lies in the temple legend of Hiram Abiff, or Hiram, already connected with the Rosicrucian current. Everything related to the so-called secret of Freemasonry and its underlying tendency is expressed in this temple legend, which leads back to a kind of genesis and a conception of human evolution. In this account, one of the Elohim unites with Eve, and from the union of divine creative spirit and Eve, Cain is born. Another Elohim, Jehovah or Adonai, creates Adam, regarded as the primal human of the third root race. Adam then unites with Eve, and from this union Abel is born. Thus, at the beginning of human evolution there are two lines of descent: Cain, the direct descendant of one of the Elohim through Eve, and Abel, who, through Adam created with divine assistance, represents the line associated with Jehovah. The underlying idea of this creation narrative is that there exists a fundamental opposition between Jehovah and everything derived from the other Elohim and their descendants, the so-called sons of fire, as the descendants of Cain are named in the temple legend. Jehovah establishes enmity between Cain and his race on the one side, and Abel and his race on the other. From this opposition arises the event in which Cain slays Abel, representing the deep conflict between those who receive existence from the divine world and those who must shape everything through their own effort. The contrast is also expressed in the offerings. Abel's sacrifice of an animal is pleasing to Jehovah, while Cain's offering of the fruits of the earth is not. Cain must wrest sustenance from the earth through labor, while Abel receives what is already living and prepared. In this sense, the Cain line brings forth the living from the lifeless, while Abel receives what is already living. Abel's sacrifice is accepted, while Cain's is rejected. Thus two types of human being are characterized, one who receives what is prepared by God, and another, the free humanity, who works the soil and transforms the lifeless into living products. Those who recognize themselves as sons of Cain understand the temple legend and seek to live according to it. From the Cain lineage come the creators of human arts and sciences: Tubal-Cain, the first true architect and master of metalwork, and Hiram Abiff, or Hiram, the central figure of the temple legend. Hiram is summoned by King Solomon, renowned for his wisdom and associated with the Abel line, which receives wisdom from God. Thus the contrast appears again at Solomon's court: Solomon as the divinely wise ruler, and Hiram as the independent worker who attains wisdom through human striving. Solomon calls Balkis, the queen of Sheba, to his court. Upon seeing him, she experiences him as a figure like a statue of gold and precious stones, as though he were a monument bestowed upon humanity by the gods. When she beholds the temple, she desires to meet its architect, and this encounter is granted. With a single glance from Hiram, she recognizes his true nature. Solomon is immediately filled with jealousy toward Hiram, and this deepens when Balkis asks to be shown all the workers of the temple. Solomon declares this impossible, but Hiram agrees. He ascends a small elevation, makes the mystical sign of the Tau, and at once all the workers gather around him. Thus the queen's wish is fulfilled. Because of this, Solomon refrains from opposing those who become enemies of Hiram. Among these opponents are a Syrian stonemason, a Phoenician carpenter, and a Jewish miner. These three had been denied the master word by Hiram Abiff, the secret word that would enable them to work independently as master builders, a secret granted only to those who have attained the necessary degree. Out of resentment, they decide to harm him. The opportunity arises when Hiram Abiff undertakes his greatest work, the casting of the molten sea. The movement of the waters is to be held in fixed form. The living sea is to be preserved artistically in a rigid artistic shape. The three apprentices conspire to corrupt the casting so that the molten mass will not flow properly into the mold, but will overflow and destroy the work. Hiram attempts to stop the flowing fire by pouring water upon it, but this only causes the metal to rise and fall again in a violent rain of fire. He becomes powerless against the catastrophe. At that moment a voice calls to him, "Hiram, Hiram, Hiram." He is commanded to plunge into the sea of fire. He obeys and sinks ever deeper until he reaches the center of the earth, where fire has its origin. There he encounters two figures, his ancestor Tubal-Cain and Cain himself, who is surrounded by the radiance of Lucifer, the angel of light. Tubal-Cain then gives Hiram his hammer, endowed with the power to restore all things to their rightful order, and declares that he will beget a son who will gather a race of wise human beings around him, becoming the ancestor of those born out of fire that brings wisdom and awakens thought. With this hammer, the molten sea is restored. The figure of Hiram and the Queen Baucis are described as meeting again outside the city, where she becomes his wife. Yet Hiram is unable to avert the jealousy of Solomon and the revenge of the three fellow craftsmen, and he is slain by them. The only thing he succeeds in saving is the triangle with the master word engraved upon it, which he casts into a deep well. Hiram is then buried, and an acacia branch is planted on his grave. This acacia branch later reveals the location of the grave to Solomon, and the triangle is also discovered. It is sealed and placed in a hidden location known only to a very small number of people, 27 in all. It is agreed that the new master word should be the first word spoken after the discovery of the corpse, and this becomes the word used in Freemasonry. In this way, Freemasons trace their origin, with some justification, to the temple legend and to the ancient time in which the temple was built by Solomon as a lasting memorial to the secret of the fifth root race. From here, it becomes necessary to understand how humanity is meant to benefit from Freemasonry, which is not a simple matter. Anyone who becomes acquainted with the complex initiation ceremonies might even be inclined to ask whether what takes place is not something trivial or petty. The initiation ceremony for an apprentice entering the order of craft masonry is then described. Someone who has decided to become a member of craft masonry enters a system consisting of 3 degrees: apprentice, fellow craftsman, and master mason. Beyond these lie higher degrees that are intended to lead the candidate into occult knowledge. When a novice is to be initiated into the first degree, that of apprentice, he is first brought into the lodge and led by the brother warden into a remote chamber, where he is left alone for a time with his thoughts. He is then deprived of all metal he carries, such as gold and silver. His clothing is altered by being torn at the knee, and the heel of his left shoe is turned down. In this condition, he is led into the presence of the assembled brethren. A cord is placed around his neck, and a sword is pointed toward his bare breast. He is then confronted by the worshipful master, who asks whether he still wishes to undergo initiation. He is warned seriously, and the symbolic meaning of the altered clothing and other acts is explained. He is required to renounce 3 things. If he cannot renounce them, he is told he can never be accepted as a Freemason. First, he must abandon all curiosity about everything, otherwise he must leave immediately. Second, he must be willing to acknowledge all his faults and mistakes without reservation. Third, he must be able to rise above all distinctions that separate one human being from another. These are strictly required from every candidate. After this, a frame is held before him through which he is symbolically thrown, accompanied by an unpleasant noise, so that he experiences the impression of being cast through it in a disturbing way. He is told that he is being thrown into hell, and at the same moment a trapdoor is closed with a loud sound, creating the impression of a sudden descent into strange surroundings. His skin is lightly scratched so that a small amount of blood appears, while those around him produce sounds suggesting that he is losing much blood. 3 hammer blows are then struck by the worshipful master. Everything spoken thereafter in the lodge is to remain in strict secrecy, under penalty that betrayal would change his relationship to Freemasonry. This is also symbolized by a drink offered in a vessel that tastes sweet on one side and bitter when turned, indicating the consequences of betrayal. The candidate is then led to a staircase in a dimly lit room. The staircase is constructed so that it moves, creating the impression of a long descent when in reality it is short. The same illusion applies when he is made to fall, believing he has dropped into a deep well while in truth the fall is slight. He is told he has reached a decisive moment and is again blindfolded near the staircase. The brother warden is asked whether the candidate is worthy of the society. If the answer is affirmative, he is asked what is desired for the candidate, and the reply is light. The blindfold is then removed, and he finds himself in an illuminated chamber. He is asked whether he recognizes his master, and he replies that it is the one wearing a yellow jacket and blue trousers, the latter indicating rank. He then receives the 3 attributes of apprenticeship: sign, grip, and word. The sign is a symbolic gesture of an occult nature. The grip is a particular form of handshake used within the degree, differing between apprentice and master. The word varies according to degree, and its content is not disclosed. After this, the person can be admitted into apprenticeship. Upon admission he is asked, "How old are you?" and he answers, "Not yet 7 years." In symbolic meaning, he must serve 7 years as an apprentice before progressing to become a journeyman. When someone has advanced far enough to be eligible for the master's degree, the initiation becomes more demanding. The essential point is that what is contained in the temple legend is now carried out in a practical way upon the candidate himself. The one who seeks the master's degree is led into a room of the lodge and is placed in a coffin, undergoing symbolically the same fate as the master builder Hiram. After this, the new sign, grip, and word are revealed. The word is the same master word that was spoken when Hiram's body was discovered. The signs by which a master is recognized are highly complex, and recognition depends on many gestures and forms. Masters of Freemasonry refer to themselves as children of the widow. In this sense, the company of masters is directly linked to the Manichaean current. The connection between Manichaeism and Freemasonry is further indicated as something to be explained more fully elsewhere. The task of Freemasonry is connected with the overall mission of the 5th root race. From a modern rational standpoint, the described initiation of an apprentice and its ceremonies might easily be dismissed as mere play-acting or empty ritual, but this is not its nature. These actions are symbolic enactments of ancient occult processes that once took place on the astral plane within mystery schools. What is performed symbolically in Freemasonry is, in those older mysteries, an actual event on a higher level. The initiation into the master degree, including lying in the coffin and related acts, belongs to such higher realities, though in Freemasonry it appears only in symbolic form. It may then be asked, what is the purpose of all this? The Freemason is meant to become aware that his actions on the physical plane should maintain a connection with the spiritual worlds. It matters whether one belongs to a community that lives in symbols which point to a higher reality, or not. A Freemason does not necessarily think differently from an ordinary person, but his feeling life is shaped differently. Feelings are bound up with symbolic actions, and it is not without consequence whether such feelings are awakened, since they correspond to certain rhythms on the astral plane. The meaning of the first part of the ceremony, the removal of metal objects, is that the candidate should carry nothing that he has not earned through his own work. Whoever understands symbols should carry this awareness as a feeling. The tearing at the knee of the clothing is meant to leave a lasting impression, reminding him that he should present himself in life as though appearing outwardly naked before other human beings. The lowering of the heel serves as a continual reminder that, even if strong within Freemasonry, a person remains vulnerable in his Achilles heel. All later parts of the ceremony carry similar meanings, especially the unsettling sensation produced when a cold, sharp sword is placed against the breast. This impression remains and becomes a suggestion that returns at decisive moments, reminding the candidate to develop a kind of inner cold-bloodedness. Responsibility for one's own actions is symbolized by the cord around the neck, which can be tightened at any moment. Presence of mind is suggested through experiences involving trapdoors, moving stairs, and similar effects, which in the ancient mysteries occurred on the astral plane rather than as physical imitation. The candidate must then take the oath. Everything around him is dark and frightening, with a room lit only by a few small flames. The oath, in its essential form, states that by word, sign, and grip he will never reveal what is communicated within the lodge, and that if he betrays the secrets, he consents to severe symbolic penalties inflicted by the brethren. The oath of the journeyman is even more severe, including symbolic references to bodily destruction, and the master's oath is of such intensity that it is not repeated in detail. These elements are intended to produce a specific rhythm in the sensations of the astral body. Through this rhythm, the spirit is influenced in an intuitive way. In ancient times, this influence on the spirit was the main purpose of Masonic initiation, since Freemasonry is regarded as very ancient in origin. The Freemasons of earlier times were in fact stonemasons in the literal sense, carrying out all the tasks of masonry. They were the builders of temples and public buildings in ancient Greece, where they were known as Dionysiacs. Their work was performed in service of the temple of Dionysus. In Egypt, they were the builders of the pyramids, in ancient Rome the founders of cities, and in the Middle Ages the builders of cathedrals and churches. After the 13th century, they began to work more independently of ecclesiastical authority, and at that time the term Freemason came into use. Before this, they stood under the authority of religious communities and were regarded as recognized architects. Starting from the fact that Freemasons were builders of pyramids, mystery temples, and churches, it becomes clear, especially when studying Vitruvius, that architecture in earlier times was approached in a fundamentally different way from today. It was not learned through calculation, but through intuitions communicated by means of symbols. A sense of this older manner of building can be gained from descriptions of how Lemurian humanity developed architectural capacities. In that earlier time, building in the modern sense was not possible. The structures of ancient China, Babylon, and Assyria evoke astonishment precisely because they were created without modern mathematical knowledge. The construction of Lake Moeris in Egypt, a vast reservoir designed to collect and redirect water for irrigation, likewise did not arise from modern engineering techniques. Even the remarkable acoustic properties of ancient buildings were achieved by methods that modern architecture cannot yet reproduce. Building was then based on intuitive faculties rather than rational calculation. This form of architecture was closely connected with knowledge of the cosmos. In the Egyptian pyramids, for example, proportions correspond to spatial relationships in the heavens, including the positions and distances of stars. The configuration of stellar space was reflected in these structures. Each building was related to the dome of the sky, and the rhythmic order perceived in the starry heavens, grasped not merely through the senses but through an intuitive perception of higher, living relationships, was incorporated into architecture itself. In this way, buildings were constructed out of the universe as a whole. This ancient art of building was taught in a manner as different from modern instruction as the healing practices of certain indigenous peoples differ from contemporary medicine. Modern training is based on intellectual understanding, whereas in older cultures the physician developed specific inner, almost occult capacities. Such training required rigorous bodily discipline that would appear extreme to modern sensibilities, cultivating indifference to pleasure and pain, which was regarded as a prerequisite for acquiring certain higher powers. In its most developed form, the training of the astral body led to abilities that were described as the royal art, derived from symbolic relationships of cosmic proportions. From this perspective, it becomes possible to understand what Freemasonry once was, and why it necessarily lost its original function as human thinking became increasingly rationalistic. It retained significance during the development of the fourth cultural epoch, but its importance diminished with the rise of the fifth. In the present time, Freemasons are no longer necessarily builders in the original sense, and membership is open to many. For occult understanding, symbols are never merely decorative or conventional. A symbol has meaning only when it represents a living force capable of becoming real. When a symbol acts upon the human spirit in such a way that intuitive forces are awakened, it is a true symbol. Modern Freemasonry often speaks of symbols as representations of ideas, but in the older sense an occult symbol directly influences the will and works into the astral body. With the dominance of intellectual culture, the original meaning of Freemasonry has therefore receded. With regard to connections with Manichaeism, the subject is interrupted here. After the basic degrees follow the higher degrees, extending up to the 90th and even the 96th degree, beginning from the 4th degree onward. The significance of the first 3 degrees has gradually shifted into these higher stages. A remnant of the older tradition is still preserved in what is called the Royal Ark, which continues to exist within Freemasonry today. The position from which these remarks are made is explicitly different from that adopted in relation to other subjects, since it is generally stated that only personal experience could allow a full account of Freemasonry in its inner essence. The present account is therefore given from a non-Masonic standpoint and from a theosophical perspective, with the reservation that full justice to the subject would require someone within Freemasonry itself, though even such full disclosure is described as unlikely for other reasons. For this reason, the statements are to be received with caution. At the same time, even though only a Freemason would normally be considered capable of speaking about its true inner core, it is suggested that no such Freemason in the whole of Europe presently exists in a genuine sense. Since the 18th century, Freemasonry is described as having entered a highly unusual stage of development. What was previously described about it is therefore to be understood as relating to an earlier form, as it might have been in the 16th or 17th centuries. In its present condition, Freemasonry is characterized as a kind of empty shell without its original inner content, comparable to a petrified plant that remains only as a crust or external form. Ordinary craft masonry is not considered relevant for the deeper questions being addressed, since this form, with its 3 degrees of apprentice, journeyman, and master, is traced back to the Charter of Cologne in the 16th century. In its present state, it functions primarily as an association for mutual support, stimulation, and educational development among its members. The first 3 degrees are regarded as only the final remnants of an earlier system of initiation, and if the ceremonies were still carried out in their original form, apprentices, journeymen, and masters would be initiated in the manner previously described. Although regulations still prescribe such procedures, only a few are aware of their existence, and even fewer understand their meaning. The effects previously described in relation to the astral plane are not consciously understood within craft masonry. Both the British lodges and the St. John lodges in Germany are described as maintaining these 3 degrees in essentially the same condition. Nevertheless, the presence of symbols within these degrees still allows for the possibility of penetrating to a deeper underlying wisdom. An indication of this is found in the example of a well-known Mason who addressed his brethren in such a way that a theosophical awareness becomes visible in his words. This individual is identified as Goethe. From a theosophical standpoint, familiarity can be recognized in 2 verses from a Masonic poem intended for fellow lodge members. Yet call from beyond, the voices of spirits, the voices of masters. Omit not to practice the powers of the good. Crowns here are woven, in quiet eternal, rewarding with plenty. Those who are active, we beg you, have hope. In these lines, reference is made to masters within the lodge context, even though those present may not fully grasp the depth of the meaning being expressed. It is noted that within the atmosphere of a Masonic lodge, through the presence of symbols, certain vibrations are set in motion that influence the astral body and thereby produce real effects, even if this is not consciously recognized by most Freemasons. Those with knowledge of these connections may still make use of them. Those who advance beyond the first 3 degrees into the higher degrees are described as possessing a greater degree of consciousness. The first of these higher stages is the Royal Ark degree, also referred to as the degree of Royal Art. This degree is characterized by a chapter structure with a more deeply meaningful organization. In its gatherings, particularly during initiations of new members, no more than 12 participants are present, and these members are understood not merely as individuals but as representatives of specific qualities in accordance with the principle of occult brotherhoods. The foremost figure among the 12 is called Zerubbabel. He is regarded as the leader, the central figure from whom illumination radiates to the others. He is expected to possess the highest intelligence and some knowledge of the essence of the secret sciences. It is noted, however, that in contemporary practice this ideal is seldom fully realized, appearing only rarely when suitable individuals are present. The next officer is Jeshua, the high priest. The third is Haggai the prophet. Together with Zerubbabel, these three form the Grand Council. After them come the first and second principals, then the two scribes, Ezra and Nehemiah, and the janitor or tiler without the door. Then follow the so-called lesser companions. No more than 12 persons may be present at any time, and these 12 are taken as representing the 12 signs of the zodiac. The entire arrangement is understood as a portrayal of the sun's passage through the 12 signs of the zodiac, recalling the way Masons originally reproduced astronomical laws in buildings such as churches and cathedrals. The lodge is arranged, though not everywhere in the same form, as a large square hall with a vaulted ceiling painted blue and covered with golden stars to represent the heavens. The positions of those present are strictly ordered by ritual. The novices, entering last, take their place in the north, as they are not yet able to endure warmth. In the east stands Zerubbabel. In the west are Jeshua the high priest and Haggai the prophet. Those in the south are bound together by a rope, each one wound 3 times, linking them at a distance of roughly 3 to 4 decimeters. The one initiated into this 4th degree, the first of the higher degrees, still preserves in certain regions a faint sense of the temple legend. 3 veils must be passed. At each veil a secret is communicated. The hidden meaning of a verse from the Pentateuch is revealed, followed by an explanation of the Tau sign, and finally the master word is given, by which members of the 4th degree recognize one another. Above all, the initiate is instructed in how ancient Freemasonry is understood. Craft Masonry is usually unaware of this, and even when it hears it, it lacks any real comprehension. The origin of Freemasonry is described in a traditional form. Adam, the first man, is presented as the first Mason, possessing an exceptional knowledge of geometry after the expulsion from paradise, and regarded as a direct descendant of light. Yet the deeper origin is said to precede humanity entirely, residing in light itself, existing before mankind. This indicates, for those who can understand it, a connection with theosophical teaching concerning the formation of the earth through the first 2 root races and into the third, the Lemurian age. Whoever grasps this through Freemasonry receives something of great significance. Yet such understanding is rare, since Freemasonry is described as having declined, becoming a kind of remnant. Since the 16th century, little understanding has remained of its true meaning, that a temple should be built so its proportions reflect cosmic proportions, and a cathedral should be constructed so its acoustics echo the harmony of the spheres, the source of all outer acoustics. This original knowledge was gradually lost. When de Saguiers reunited Freemasonry in England in the early 18th century, there was already little understanding that the term Freemasonry referred quite literally to the craft of building, where Masons constructed churches and temples according to cosmic laws and incorporated heavenly, not merely earthly, proportions. With this loss came the disappearance of the living awareness of how architecture transforms sound, how speech is reflected by walls and altered in its effect. The builders of the great medieval cathedrals were once the true Freemasons, conscious that the spoken word of the priest was carried back by the walls so that the congregation was immersed in a living sea of sound, a vibrating field that affected the astral body even more than the physical ear. This awareness was inevitably lost in the New Age, leaving Freemasonry as only a shell of its former reality. Alongside these 3 degrees there are also higher degrees, more fully preserved in larger bodies in Great Britain, America, Italy, Egypt, and in Eastern Freemasonry, especially that known as Oriental or Memphis Masonry. In Germany, where a branch of Memphis Misraim Freemasonry exists with wider connections, the higher degrees also function. Yet within German St. John Freemasonry, there is so little understanding of their meaning that they are often regarded as meaningless. For this reason, the Grand Orient of Germany is compelled simply to allow the St. John Masons to be recognized outwardly as Masons. Significant differences are noted between Masonry as practiced in Germany and that found in England or Great Britain. In British Masonry, a form of reconciliation was reached through the Articles of Union of the year 1813 between craft Masonry, with its 3 degrees, and those branches of Masonry that recognize the higher degrees. Thus, within craft Masonry, an apprentice is permitted not only to enter but also to progress into the 4th, 5th, and 6th degrees, that is, into the higher degrees, with the earlier craft degrees being acknowledged within the English system. In Germany, however, the situation is different. The German Grand Orient of the Memphis and Misraim order undertakes the working of the 3 lowest degrees itself, meaning that an Oriental Freemason must already have passed through the first 3 degrees at the outset. Moreover, there is an obligation to progress at least to the 18th degree, without resting before that stage is reached. A member of the German St. John system is therefore not admitted into the higher degrees of Oriental Masonry without first having completed the 3 lesser degrees. Orient Masonry itself is presented as a graduated instruction in occultism. Beyond the Royal Arch degree, it offers what is described as a structured training in successive stages. First a form of astral training extending up to approximately the 18th or 20th degrees, then a further development described as a kind of mental training, leading into life on the mental plane and extending up to around the 60th or 70th degree. And finally the highest stage, the most profound occult instruction, which is said to extend within the Grand Orient up to the 96th degree. Only very few in Germany are said to have reached the 96th degree. Yet it is emphasized that modern Masonry has retained only a fragment of what it once encompassed. It is especially noteworthy that those attributed with the higher degrees, including the 96th, have not always passed through a continuous Masonic formation. In fact, there are scarcely any who have completed the full sequence of degrees through Masonic training itself. Some individuals are said to hold elevated degrees such as the 3rd, the 33rd, or even the 96th, but these distinctions are not generally obtained through Masonic training alone, but through other occult institutions, after which their knowledge is incorporated into Freemasonry in a kind of attempted restoration. In blunt terms, Freemasonry in this respect is considered to rely on knowledge originating from other occult schools. In this sense, a manifesto issued by the Grand Orient of the Memphis and Misraim Rite is regarded as an ideal formulation rather than something intended for literal practice in the present time. It is explicitly emphasized that no Freemason, even one attributed with the 96th degree, would assume responsibility for transmitting or applying these prescriptions directly, since the full experiential path behind them is not actually completed within the system itself. The manifesto concerning the secrets of the higher occult degrees states that one of the highest secrets consists in providing the appropriately prepared brother with practical means for building the true Temple of Solomon within the human being, and for restoring the lost word. In this sense, the order is said to offer the initiated and selected brother practical means by which proof of pure immortality may be attained during earthly life. Another central point is strictly observed in all true centers of occult training: the prohibition of invoking spirits or engaging in spiritualistic practices. Anyone who participates in spiritualism is excluded without exception. This secret is described as belonging exclusively to the higher occult degrees of the order. It is said to have been transmitted orally from the ancestors of all true Freemasons, referred to as the wise men of the East, and is preserved and passed on only in this manner. At the same time, it is emphasized that the effectiveness of such instruction depends entirely upon the candidate. Even the most complete and carefully prepared guidance is of no value unless it is actively applied. As an example, no one can learn to swim without entering the water and moving hands and feet. Similarly, no one can learn to paint merely through instruction or demonstration of colors unless the brush is taken in hand and practice is undertaken. In the same way, the attainment of the intended knowledge requires active inner participation. Those who are regarded as discoverers of this secret are said to have guarded it as a rare, self-acquired possession. In order to avoid misunderstanding or ridicule from the outer world, it has been preserved in symbolic form, as remains customary to the present day. The symbols are no longer intelligible to the Freemason of the present day. Such symbols are not arbitrarily chosen images. They are not illustrations produced at will, as when a lecturer says he will present something graphically. These symbols are understood as having been taken from the things themselves, as if engraved by nature. Whoever recognizes them for what they are, whoever can truly read what they contain, is brought into contact with their inner essence and is led by them into the nature of the thing itself. They are not merely symbolic representations, but portray the reality directly. Within Freemasonry, however, there is no longer anyone able to provide guidance that leads fully into this inner reality. It is said of these symbols that they are not arbitrary images and do not arise from chance, but are grounded in the attributes of God and of man, and must be regarded as archetypal. Yet the form, vessel, ritual, and symbol are never to be mistaken for their content. Rather, the spiritual content must be sought within the form. In this way, once the spiritual content is found and absorbed, the necessity of the form, ritual, and symbolism is recognized through that very content. It is further stated that the higher degrees themselves offer the brother a certain proof of human immortality, if they were truly worked in their original sense. This is described as the great longing of humanity since the time when human beings became capable of rational thought. Humanity, it is said, requires certainty of life after death in order to find full happiness in earthly life. For this reason, all mysteries within religions and centers of hidden wisdom have addressed this question as their highest task. The Church is also said to concern itself with a lost word or lost immortality, yet it leads the seeker along a path of grace, presenting it as a gift from above rather than something achieved through personal effort. The Order, by contrast, is described as placing it within the capacity of each individual seeker, through practical means, to unite consciously and freely with world consciousness and the ultimate forces of creation. This implies entry into and union with a realm otherwise accessible only through the gate of death. From all this, it may be concluded that what once belonged to the deepest foundations of the world was formerly present in Freemasonry, but today remains only as an empty shell. The question arises as to why this has become so. The meaning of the temple legend and operative masonry, like all intuitive knowledge, had to be lost to humanity because the fifth cultural epoch is fundamentally the epoch of understanding. For a time, intuition had to fall silent in human evolution, whereas Freemasonry is rooted in an intuitive way of knowing and acting. Reference is made to Vitruvius and to the symbolic architectural instructions he gave, which can only be followed through genuine intuition. In modern times, such symbolic guidance has been replaced by intellectual and rational methods. Reason had to become dominant for a time, since all that humanity has gained through mastery of nature must be integrated into the total organism of human activity. This relates to the meaning that the entire mineral kingdom is to be included in the further evolution of the world during the present cycle of development, in such a way that human beings gradually transform nature through their own spirituality. This is described as the meaning of the molten sea, that mineral nature itself will be transformed. Human beings work in industry in order to weave organization and spirit into the mineral world. In this way, the whole mineral kingdom is continually reshaped by human intelligence and spirit. This recasting of nature, this transformation of the mineral realm, will be completed by the end of the present cycle of evolution, when all mineral nature will have been changed and impressed by humanity, just as a stamp is impressed into metal when a watch is formed. Then, when a new cycle of evolution begins, the mineral kingdom will be able to be taken up and absorbed. At this point in this lecture, Rudolf Steiner pointed out that in order for this development to be fully completed, the entire mode of thinking that has dominated humanity since the 16th century must be carried into the atom. Only when rational thinking is capable of grasping the atom, according to Steiner, will Freemasonry be able to revive in a new form. Please have in mind that these lectures were given by Steiner in early 1900s, and at this point in history, the field of physics wasn't quite the same as it is today. For example, quantum physics was not yet developed. In fact, it is around this time when first steps towards it started. Steiner continues by stating that in an initial stage, the external form will be understood. The next step will come when human thought is able to enter into the mineral atom itself and comprehend how to use what lives within it and place it in service of the whole. It was only in the time of the early 1900s that human thought began to pursue natural forces down to the atomic level, especially through the developments in the understanding of electricity. In this context, attention is drawn to a speech by the English Prime Minister Balfour on the worldview of that time, significant at least in its outward implications, in which he points to an important turning point in human thought and shows some awareness of this transition. In this way, it was seen how something was beginning to dawn within scientific consciousness that pointed toward the future. Steiner also pointed out that this has been known in occult understanding since the late 19th century. It is asserted that a new point of departure from the atom into the mineral physical world will arise. This is expected to enter human evolution in the sixth cultural epoch, and through it Freemasonry itself will be renewed. Within Freemasonry, occult knowledge is seen as something remarkable and ancient, preserving extremely old traditions in a highly structured form, even though much of its original content has been lost and is no longer clearly understood in Europe. Nevertheless, the structure remains, awaiting renewal. The outer shell is still present, ready to be filled once more with living content and brought back to life. Rites connected with Memphis, Oriental rites, and Grand Orient traditions are referred to in connection with a discussion among occultists as to whether occult doctrine can be made public or not. From such deliberations it becomes apparent that two main tendencies exist, a left and a right tendency, one inclined toward free thought and the other toward conservatism. Attention is drawn to the importance of speaking about the higher degrees of Freemasonry, since this mode of instruction is said to set itself specific tasks, certain aspects of which are to be considered further. The focus is mainly on the combined rite of Memphis and Misraim. It is noted that this system contains a large number of degrees, reaching into the 90s, and that the highest leaders of the Grand Orients, such as those of Germany, Great Britain, and America, are associated with the 96th degree. These degrees are arranged in such a way that up to approximately the 80th or 89th level, they are structured in a particular graded form. From around the 87th degree onward, the actual occult degrees are said to begin, into which no one may be initiated without a thorough prior study of the subject. It is repeatedly stated that in Europe there is no one who has passed through all these degrees in a complete occult Masonic training. This, however, is considered of secondary importance for Freemasonry itself, since its renewed task is still expected in the future, when the necessary organization and vessel will be available for what is to be accomplished. Various branches of Freemasonry and their tendencies are then considered. It is emphasized that the entire system of higher Masonic degrees is traced back to a personality often spoken of but widely misunderstood, especially by 19th century historians who are said to lack insight into the difficulties faced by occultists. This figure is the controversial and little understood Cagliostro, the so-called Count Cagliostro, in whom an individuality was concealed that was recognized in its true nature only by the highest initiates, originally attempted to raise Freemasonry in London to a higher stage. At the end of the 18th century, Freemasonry had already reached the condition previously described. His attempt in London failed, as did later efforts in Russia and at The Hague, for specific reasons. Success was only achieved in Lyons, where from a group of local Masons he formed an occult Masonic lodge of the Philoliths, or Searchers After Truth, known as the Lodge of Triumphing Wisdom. The aim of this lodge is attributed to Cagliostro, although what is commonly written about it is regarded as the work of uninformed observers. Only a limited indication can be given of its true intention. Two main concerns are attributed to Cagliostro. First, instruction for the production of the so-called Philosopher's Stone. Second, the development of understanding of the mystic pentagram. These are mentioned only in outline, and although often treated with skepticism, they are not regarded as mere symbols, but as based on real facts. The Philosopher's Stone is said to have a specific purpose, namely to extend human life to a span of 5,527 years. From a free-thinking standpoint this may appear absurd, yet it is asserted that through special training it is possible to prolong life indefinitely by learning to exist independently of the physical body. At the same time, it is clarified that this does not imply immunity from physical death in the ordinary sense, since an adept could still be struck down by external physical events, such as a collapsing roof tile, if such an event is permitted. The point is not physical immortality in the ordinary sense, but a transformed relation to death. For one who has truly understood the Philosopher's Stone and learned to separate from it in the intended manner, physical death becomes only an apparent event. For others it remains a real and decisive rupture, but for such an adept it is no longer a turning point. What appears to observers as death is only an external observation, while the individual himself does not actually die in the same sense. Rather, It is described as a gradual learning process in which the individual becomes accustomed during life to everything that otherwise occurs abruptly at death. What takes place at death has already been inwardly accomplished beforehand. Death therefore ceases to be an event for such a person, since existence without the physical body has long been mastered. The physical body is then laid aside in the same way one removes a coat, and a new body is taken up again as one would put on another garment. The account continues with an indication that these teachings attributed to Cagliostro are meant to suggest a first lesson, the philosopher's stone, understood as a means by which physical death is rendered of minor significance in relation to a higher mode of existence. The second teaching concerns the knowledge of the pentagram, understood as the capacity to distinguish the 5 bodies of human existence from one another. When physical body, etheric body, astral body, common body, and causal body, or higher monos, are spoken of in ordinary terms, these remain merely abstract expressions. In such a case, nothing essential is gained. In contemporary conditions, the physical body itself is scarcely truly known. Only through what is called the pentagram is it said to become possible to know the 5-fold constitution as objective reality. A body is not understood merely by inhabiting it, but by being able to regard it as something external. This is what separates the ordinary person from one who has undergone a training in which the 5-fold nature of the human being becomes an object of perception. The ordinary individual lives within these bodies but cannot step outside them in consciousness. At most, the physical body can be observed indirectly, as in a mirror or through external perception. Those who were guided through Cagliostro's methods are said to have reached something similar to what certain Rosicrucian streams aimed at, namely a schooling in which the 5 bodies are experienced as real and not as concepts. This is referred to as the knowledge of the pentagram and moral rebirth. It is noted that the pupils of Cagliostro did not, in general, reach complete realization, but many are said to have attained a perception of the astral body. His strength lay particularly in leading students toward an awareness of this level of existence. Before the collapse of his activity, he is described as having established groups in Paris, in Belgium, in St. Petersburg, and in other parts of Europe, in addition to Lyons, from which individuals later emerged who were able to progress toward the 18th, 19th, and 20th higher degrees of Freemasonry. After this period, he ended his life in imprisonment in Rome. It is emphasized that judgments about such a figure are inadequate when based on ordinary understanding, since the relationship between external actions and wider world events is not properly grasped. In earlier discussions on the temple legend, it is remarked that the French Revolution is said to have arisen out of certain secret occult societies, and that further investigation of these currents would lead back to schools of adepts. Reference is then made to a depiction by Mabel Collins in her novel Fleeta, where an adept is portrayed as working with a kind of world chessboard, moving pieces that represent the karmic conditions of larger regions. Although this description is not presented as literally accurate, it is suggested that it reflects in distorted form a far greater reality of similar nature. From such background currents, it is said, the French Revolution proceeded. A well-known account from the writings of the Countess d'Himer describes an event prior to the outbreak of the Revolution, when the Countess, a lady-in-waiting to Marie Antoinette, is said to have been visited by the Count of Saint-Germain. He requested an audience with the Queen and the King, but opposition from the minister of Louis XVI prevented his admission. In this account, he nevertheless warned the Queen in detail of approaching dangers, warnings that were not heeded. On that occasion he is said to have expressed the saying that those who sow the wind reap the whirlwind, adding that this saying had been uttered long before and repeated in later times in another form. Such statements were regarded as incomprehensible from an ordinary standpoint. It is further stated that the Count of Saint-Germain died in the year 1784 at the court of the Landgrave of Hesse, who later became associated with advanced forms of Freemasonry, and that he was cared for there until his death. However, according to the memoirs of the Countess d'Himer, he was seen repeatedly even after the year 1784, appearing several times in later years. In another account, he is said to have been in Vienna in the year 1790 among Rosicrucians, stating that he would withdraw to the Orient for a period of 85 years, after which his activity in Europe would again become perceptible. The year 1875 is mentioned in this connection as a significant point of later renewed attention. It is also stated that in the circle associated with the Landgrave of Hesse, two central themes were present: the philosopher's stone and the knowledge of the pentagram. The form of Freemasonry associated with this current is described as continuing in a more diluted manner, often referred to as the Egyptian rite of Memphis and Misraim, tracing its origin through Misraim to ancient Eastern and Egyptian mysteries, and further back to Atlantean sources, forming an unbroken traditional current. A distinction is then made between higher-degree Freemasonry and ordinary craft masonry. Craft masonry is described as resting on a democratic principle, which, when applied to knowledge, leads primarily to the exchange of personal opinions. Truth, however, is presented as something not subject to opinion. It is either known or not known. Just as the sum of the angles of a triangle is not a matter of personal view, higher truths are likewise not matters for debate. From this standpoint, ordinary discussion is characterized as remaining on the level of subjective illusion, comparable to expressing opinions about mathematical necessity without understanding it. The implication is that the democratic principle is not applicable to the acquisition of knowledge, since knowledge is not determined by agreement but by recognition. Higher-degree Masonry is therefore described as a gradual approach to truth itself, in which recognition replaces opinion. Once something is known, only one position remains possible toward it. Either it is known or it is not. In this sense, the system of 96 degrees is presented as having a certain inner justification. At the head of this structure stands the so-called sovereign sanctuary, identified with what is known in Freemasonry as the Grand Orient, and regarded as the holder of genuine occult knowledge. From this position, the path and the speech can be understood, as indicated in Masonic manifestos, which is said to make it possible to perceive the voice of the wise men of the East. Only one who has advanced to this stage is considered capable of hearing the voice of the wise masters. To reach this point, however, requires having worked through many stages, acquiring definite knowledge together with inner qualities and capacities that go far beyond conventional bourgeois virtues and belong to something more inward and significant. It is also noted that, in comparison with what is discussed in this context, the theoretical and practical content of theosophical literature represents only an elementary level. The theoretical side of the higher degrees of Freemasonry is therefore described as far surpassing what can be made public within popular theosophy. What can be communicated at all depends on what is permitted by adepts to be made accessible to a certain level, since not all knowledge can be openly disclosed. It is stated that humanity will in the near future be surprised by certain discoveries, though these will be premature and may therefore lead to confusion or disruption. One of the tasks attributed to the Theosophical Society is to prepare people for such developments. As an example, what is referred to as knowledge of the philosopher's stone is said to have been more widely known in earlier times and even during a period of the Atlantean epoch, when the possibility of overcoming death was understood in a more general way. It is further remarked that hesitation was felt about allowing certain details of this to appear in print, and that in earlier publications references to Atlantean knowledge were intentionally left incomplete. Similar indications are said to appear in other accounts, including those transmitted through advanced mediums in the Theosophical Review, where the same theme appears in a different form. The overcoming of death in Atlantean times is described as something preserved in memory traces within individuals, often without conscious awareness. Many people living today are said to be reincarnated from that period, and such latent memories are considered capable of awakening ideas that may later be mistaken for purely modern discoveries, particularly in medicine. In reality, these would be recollections of earlier states of knowledge. Certain insights are expected to mature in the near future, making it necessary to speak of them in advance and to emphasize a gradual, step-by-step approach to knowledge. This progressive method is therefore also stressed by those seeking to revive the Misraim and Memphis rite in the present age. Even if immediate success is not achieved, such outcomes are not regarded as decisive failures. Reference is made to the American leadership of this movement, where a figure such as John Yarker is described as representing continuity and stability in its development. Concerning Great Britain and Germany, it is noted that the situation depends on the human material available, and that any participation by genuine occultists must follow the conditions set by wider laws, not personal intention alone. Any mention of the German Misraim-Memphis current should therefore not be taken as something already decisive for the future, but rather as a preparatory framework into which future content may be placed. This German branch is described as being under the general guidance of Roos, with Karl Kellner also working in the same direction, while the literary activity is attributed to Dr. Franz Hartmann, who contributes extensively through writing. In general terms, the Misraim Rite is described as containing 4 forms of instruction. Through these 4 paths, advancement through the system of 96 degrees is said to be possible. The first form is symbolic instruction, through which symbols are understood as real facts, and through which the initiate learns occult laws of nature connected with cyclic processes within humanity. The second form is philosophical instruction, described as the Egyptian Hermetic path, primarily theoretical in character. The third form is mystical instruction, centered on inner development, and, when properly applied, leading toward mastery of what is called the philosopher's stone, understood as overcoming death. In this sense, it is connected with the idea that Freemasonry can provide conviction of immortality, depending on whether this knowledge is sought. The fourth form is the Kabbalistic instruction, which concerns the recognition of the principles of world harmony in their true reality, including the fundamental structures underlying existence. Through each of these 4 paths, ascent to higher stages is described as possible. At the same time, it is stated that in the present state of Freemasonry, there is scarcely anyone willing to take responsibility for practical instruction in these matters, since such methods are not personally verified by most of those involved. The system is therefore characterized as provisional, existing as a framework for something yet to come. It is suggested that such a framework may one day be filled with genuine occult knowledge. For this reason, the existence of structured forms is considered essential. Spiritual knowledge requires suitable vessels into which it can be received. Without such forms, what is meant to be structured and transformative would remain undirected, like molten material without a mold. This is illustrated through the image of the molten sea, understood as a symbol of how spiritual substance requires form in order to be shaped and made effective. In this sense, what currently appears only in an undeveloped or latent condition is expected to receive structured expression in the future. The speech by the English Prime Minister Balfour is recalled, as it already shows that certain truths now expressed in physical science correspond to ideas that were once present in ancient occult perception. In The Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky, a passage concerning electricity is cited which closely anticipated statements that modern physicists of Steiner's time were only then gradually approaching. What was found there is understood as only a hint of the actual reality. At the center of this discussion stands the physical atom. Until only a few years prior to the time when Steiner gave these lectures, atom was generally misunderstood by external science, though not by occult knowledge. It was regarded as a body possessing mass in space, but in the early 1900s, which is the time Steiner gave these lectures, however, it has begun to be understood that the physical atom stands in relation to electricity as ice stands to water from which it has been formed. Just as ice is frozen water, so the atom was understood to be nothing other than frozen or condensed electricity. If earlier scientific descriptions of the atom were followed up to these years, they were regarded as increasingly inadequate compared with this newer understanding. The physical atom was therefore described as condensed electricity, and Steiner considered Balfour's speech on the topic of exceptional significance in this respect. As we already noted, this was beginning of the 1900s. Now in 2026, it is well known in science that all matter is a kind of appearance. The word matter in physics isn't used to refer to the hard stuff, or little particles anymore. It is used more like a symbol for what appears to be hard stuff from which the world is made. But regardless, let's return to the content of the lectures. Keep in mind that this is all said by Rudolf Steiner in the early 1900s, before all the development in quantum physics and so on. It was further stated that what has been known in occult circles for millennia has only recently begun to appear in scientific thought. Yet alongside the recognition that the atom was considered to be the condensed electricity, another question remained unresolved: the true nature of electricity itself. This remains unknown to external science, which does not yet understand where its essence must be sought. It cannot be discovered through external experiments alone. The indicated insight is that electricity, when viewed from a particular level, is identical with human thought. Human thought and electricity are described as the same reality, perceived once from within and once from without. Whoever understands electricity in this sense recognizes something living within the human being that, in a frozen condition, forms the atom. A connection is thus established between human thought and the physical atom. From this perspective, the basic building blocks of the physical world are seen as minute condensed monadic entities, condensed electricity. When humanity comes to understand this fundamental relationship between thought, electricity, and the atom, it will have grasped something of decisive importance for the future development of the sixth post-Atlantean cultural epoch. It will then also become possible to build with atoms through the power of thought. This development is described as a spiritual current that must again be shaped within forms prepared over millennia through occult activity. However, because humanity has passed through an age dominated by intellectual understanding and has turned away from inner spiritual work, these forms have become empty shells. Nevertheless, they remain as vessels into which future knowledge must be poured. Occult investigation and physical science are described as approaching truth from opposite directions. Just as Freemasonry historically developed from operative masonry connected with the building of temples and cathedrals, so in the future a new form of masonry will arise that works with the smallest building elements, namely entities of condensed electricity. This transformation implies that industry in its present form cannot continue unchanged. It is said that technological development will become chaotic if human beings do not gain insight into these deeper connections. In such a condition, actions could have distant and unrecognized consequences, where effects appear far removed from their causes, as already prefigured in the beginnings of wireless telegraphy. The development points toward a future situation in which only two paths are possible: either continued chaotic development of industry and technology, or a transformation into a morally guided structure comparable to the ideal of Freemasonry. The question is raised as to why the Catholic Church is opposed to Freemasonry. The answer given is that it does not accept what is emerging in the future. It is further stated that Pius IX was initiated into Freemasonry and attempted, through the chapter of Claremont, to establish a connection between Jesuits and Freemasons, though this effort did not succeed, leaving the historical opposition in place. It is added that ordinary clergy are largely unaware of these underlying matters. Certain monastic groups, such as the Trappists, are said to practice silence, which is understood as cultivating an inner faculty of inspired speech in a future life, an idea connected with the doctrine of reincarnation. The concluding lecture of a series on occult schools and secret societies is framed as a closing reflection before moving on to a different theme. The question arises as to the deeper purpose of secret societies and their role within world evolution. The answer given is that they are directly connected with the way beings develop and advance within existence. Just as personal development requires specific exercises, so too do such brotherhoods linked with occult science provide structured forms of training for their members. Various disciplines such as Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, and other forms of practice have historically been used in such contexts to guide initiation. It might be objected that all this could be achieved without secret societies. Yet it is asserted that the world cannot in fact dispense with them. It is stated quite directly that it is not justified to speak publicly in the manner of the Freemasonic manifesto that had been previously read. What is commonly called immortality cannot be reached without at least some familiarity with occult science. Its results do flow outward into the world through many channels. Much of this knowledge is preserved within religions, and those who participate deeply and sincerely in religious life already share in it in a preparatory way, forming an approach toward a true understanding of immortality. Yet this differs from living consciously within that reality as direct experience and awareness. Human beings have lived many times, although most are not conscious of these repeated lives. This consciousness is expected to gradually arise, since without it human life remains incomplete in awareness. The aim of occult science is not to instill a vague feeling of survival, but to bring clear and fully conscious knowledge of continuous life in the spiritual world. A fundamental law is described governing the progressive development of consciousness in future stages. What a being accomplishes in working for others' awareness contributes most strongly to the development of its own. In paradoxical form, everything done without the aim of self-centered consciousness helps preserve and strengthen consciousness itself. An example is given in the building of a house. An architect constructs it not for personal use, but for purposes unrelated to himself. While this may seem obvious, it is rarely entirely the case in reality, since many actions that appear selfless still conceal self-interest. A lawyer, for instance, appears to work for clients, yet the underlying motive often relates to earning a livelihood. To the extent that work is carried out solely for personal subsistence, spiritual gain is reduced. Conversely, everything directed toward objective purposes and the interests of others contributes to the preservation of consciousness in future evolution. This principle is presented as clear and fundamental. From this perspective, Freemasonry is considered. In its original form, it instructed its members to build structures that served no purpose connected with their own livelihood. What remains of this older form are mainly charitable institutions. Although modern lodges have lost their original connection to ancient wisdom and occult knowledge, these charitable activities still express a form of humanitarian spirit that survives as tradition, even if largely emptied of its original substance. Selfless activity is therefore presented as an essential element of Freemasonry, which originally urged work performed in service of humanity and directed toward the objective world. Human evolution is described as being situated within a stage that may be called the mineral epoch, whose task is to permeate the mineral world thoroughly with spirit. This requires a precise understanding of what it means to work upon matter with human consciousness. When a house is built, stones are taken from a quarry and shaped according to a design. In this process, raw mineral material is joined with human spirit. In the making of a machine, spirit is likewise introduced into what is otherwise purely mineral structure. Although the machine itself eventually decays and returns to dust, leaving no visible trace, what it has affected does not disappear. It passes into the very atoms themselves. Each atom is understood to carry a trace of human spirit, and this imprint remains with it permanently. It is therefore not insignificant whether an atom has once been incorporated into a machine. The atom itself is changed through this encounter with human activity, and the transformation it undergoes is not lost again. In this way, by uniting spirit with the mineral world, a lasting imprint is made upon general human consciousness, and something of human existence is carried forward into the other world. From this perspective, occult science consists in understanding how selfless action leads to the highest enhancement of consciousness. Certain individuals who clearly understood this principle acted in such a selfless way that they deliberately prevented their names from being preserved for posterity. An example given is the work known as Theologia Deutsch, whose author remains unknown. Only the designation, the man from Frankfurt, survives. This anonymity reflects an intention to contribute solely to the objective world without seeking honor or personal remembrance. In comparison, it is noted that the masters are generally not historical personalities. At times they may incarnate within historical individuals, but this is regarded as a form of sacrifice, since their level of consciousness no longer involves personal achievement or the preservation of a name, both of which are connected with self-directed activity. This principle is difficult to grasp, yet it is said to clarify the intention behind Freemasonry, which seeks to carry out its work in the world in such a way that it is concealed within cathedrals, social institutions, organizations, and charitable foundations. Selfless deeds are presented as the true foundation of immortality, since they leave their reflection in the world in an enduring way. Even small actions, such as giving a coin without self-interest, are significant only to the extent that they are truly selfless, and only this element passes into immortality. Very few human actions are entirely free of egoism. Even acts that appear good may be motivated by self-satisfaction or inner comfort. A charitable act may therefore still be egoistic if it ultimately serves personal emotional reward. In earlier times, such as the Middle Ages, the builders of cathedrals or creators of artworks often remained unknown, whereas modern times place increasing value on individual names and personal recognition. Earlier epochs are described as having been more spiritually oriented toward reality itself, while the present age tends to preserve what is transient under the illusion that it can be permanently fixed. This serves to illustrate the principle underlying secret societies, the progressive effacement of personal identity in favor of the enduring effects of one's work. The essential point is not merely that certain matters are kept secret, but that one's own participation in them remains concealed. In this way, immortality is secured through action itself. The governing rule is expressed as a direct correspondence. Whatever a person contributes to the world is returned to that person as consciousness. This is connected with the most universal laws of existence. Every human being possesses soul and spirit, both of which are destined to reach higher stages of perfection. Yet before physical incarnation, the human being is described as having existed in a different condition. Physical incarnation first began in earlier evolutionary stages following the Hyperborean and Polarian epochs. Before that, existence was purely soul-like, belonging to the world soul, and spirit belonged to the general world spirit. At that time, these realities were external, surrounding human beings as nature surrounds them today. Just as the mineral, plant, and animal worlds now exist externally, so soul and spirit once existed externally. What was once outside has become the inner life of the human being. What is now inner experience was once part of the surrounding world. In the future, a similar transformation is expected to occur. What is now external nature will be taken into the human being as inner life. The mineral world, and later the plant world, will become inward reality. This is then connected back to the earlier example. A church is built not for oneself, but for others. In doing so, a person prepares the possibility of receiving a world filled with majesty, beauty, and splendor by contributing to its majesty, beauty, and splendor. Action directed toward the higher self is not regarded as egoistic, because it is not confined to the individual self. The higher self is understood as being united with all other higher selves, so that such action is performed for all beings simultaneously. This is described as a knowledge that was already present among the Freemasons, when they participated in building, understood as the spiritualization of the mineral world. They were aware that this activity would one day become the content of their own soul. Building, in this sense, is nothing other than transforming and spiritualizing what is mineral. The essential idea is that the surrounding natural world, mineral, plant, and animal, has been given to human beings as something they initially receive without having created it. It is not their origin, but something they appropriate and take into themselves. What they themselves bring into existence in the world, however, becomes part of their future being. The mineral world is perceived as something external, but what is made out of it becomes what human beings will themselves be in the future. The same applies to what is formed from the plant world, the animal world, and the human social world. All of this becomes part of future existence. If a person establishes a charitable foundation or contributes to one, that contribution becomes part of what the person will one day be. Conversely, if nothing is done that can be inwardly taken up again from the external world, the human being remains spiritually empty. It is therefore necessary that as much as possible of the natural kingdoms, extended to include humanity itself, is spiritualized by human activity. Bringing spirit into the external world is presented as the task that has always underlain secret societies. This is said to be understandable through a simple analogy. A child learning to read and write initially has everything external to it: the teaching materials, the books, and the instruction. At first, nothing of reading exists within the child. Gradually, what was once outside is taken in, until the ability to read becomes an inner capacity. In the same way, nature will one day exist within human beings as an inner possession. Humanity originates from the world soul and has drawn into itself what was once external. Spirit was also once external, and nature too will be drawn inward in the future, becoming an active inner faculty. From this perspective arises the central idea that all development is based on involution and evolution. Involution as the taking in of what is external, evolution as the expression or giving out of what has been internalized. All processes in the universe alternate between these two movements. Even sensory perception follows this pattern. In seeing, hearing, smelling, or tasting, nature is taken in. What is perceived does not vanish without effect. Although both the eye and the external object may perish, the fact of perception remains as a lasting inner result. It is therefore suggested that humanity is moving toward an age in which understanding will extend into the atom itself. It will become commonly recognized that the atom is nothing other than condensed or congealed electricity, and that thought itself is formed from the same substance. Before the end of the present cultural epoch, it is anticipated that human beings will be able to penetrate the atom in a direct way. In such a condition, as Steiner correctly predicted the future, he imagined that a person could trigger distant effects, such as causing an explosion in a remote place like Hamburg, simply through a mechanism activated from afar, comparable in principle to wireless telegraphy that creates wave-like actions at a distance. Such possibilities would arise, according to Steiner, when the occult insight that thought and atom share the same substance is applied practically. However, it is stated that it is impossible to foresee what might result if humanity has not by then achieved selflessness. Only through the development of selflessness could humanity be protected from destructive consequences. The decline of post-Atlantean culture is attributed to a lack of morality. Earlier stages of human evolution are described as having ended through natural forces, the Lemurian through fire, the Atlantean through water, whereas the present age is said to be heading toward a catastrophe brought about by humanity itself, a war of all against all, in which human beings destroy one another through mutual conflict. The most tragic aspect of this future is presented as the fact that responsibility for it would lie entirely with human beings themselves. A very small group of human beings is described as the only ones who will survive and pass into the sixth epoch. This group is said to have developed complete selflessness. The rest of humanity, while increasingly skilled in the penetration and control of the physical forces of nature, will not reach this essential level of selflessness. Through this imbalance, they will initiate the war of all against all, which is presented as the cause of the destruction of the present civilization. In the seventh post-Atlantean cultural epoch, this conflict is said to erupt in its most extreme and terrible form. Discoveries and forces will arise that make it possible for the entire globe to function like a self-operating electrical system. The small group that has developed selflessness will be preserved in a manner that cannot be openly explained. Against this background, the importance of right form becomes clearer, as does the idea that Freemasonry became aware of the need to construct forms dedicated to selfless purposes. It is suggested that it is easier to pass into the future with inherited forms that are aligned with order than to enter it in chaos. Although empty forms are easily ridiculed, they are said to carry deep significance, because they correspond to the structure of human evolution. Humanity is described as living in the fifth period of the fifth great post-Atlantean epoch, with 2 further periods still to come. After that, 7 periods of a sixth great epoch and 7 periods of a seventh great epoch will follow. In total, this forms 16 future stages of development through which humanity must still pass. A person who can inwardly experience conditions related to these future stages is considered in a certain sense initiated, since initiation corresponds to insight into coming epochs. Within the planetary condition described, there are 7 great epochs, each divided into 7 cultural subperiods, forming 49 stages in total. In the next planetary condition, again, there will be 49 stages. These structured phases are presented as the framework through which the secrets of future evolution can be understood. The higher degrees of Freemasonry are described as originally intended to express these successive stages of human development. In this sense, Freemasonry is portrayed as providing a structured system in which a person in a given degree understands how to work toward the future and become a kind of pioneer, with higher degrees corresponding to greater capacities. If it were possible to fill these existing forms again with living content and knowledge, it is said that great benefit would result. Freemasonry would then be reanimated with genuine spirit. Yet form and content are inseparable aspects of a whole. At present, the degrees still exist, but have largely not been truly worked through. Nevertheless, they are not considered meaningless, as they are expected to be revived in the future. The fifth cultural epoch is characterized as a purely intellectual age and an age of egoism, with egoism reaching its highest point in the dominance of intellect. From this condition, humanity must ascend again towards spirituality. The essential secret of secrets is then expressed as the necessity for human beings to learn silence regarding the unfolding of their ego, and instead to take actions, not the ego itself, as the measure of value. The core lies in deeds and in the overcoming of egoism through action, where the ego remains concealed within what is done. The removal of egoistic interests from the flow of karma is described as belonging to the first degree of inner development, in which karmic burden connected to the ego is dissolved. Factors such as nation, race, gender, social position, and religion are said to influence egoism. Only when humanity has overcome these influences will it be free from egoism. In the astral body, it is described that each nation, race, and epoch corresponds to a particular color, with a fundamental base color characterizing belonging to a group. This base color is what must be overcome or dissolved. The Theosophical Society is described as working toward a harmonization of these astral colors among its members, so that a shared underlying color emerges. From this base color arises a subtle substance associated with inner spiritual forces. This process of leveling and transformation is said to lead, in outer life, to conflict and even bloody struggle. Economic competition between nations, wars of exploitation, industrial and financial struggles, and political measures will increasingly allow masses of people to be directed and compelled. Individual human beings will gain growing power over large groups. The tendency of this development is not toward democracy, but toward harsh oligarchy, in which individual control over the masses becomes greater. If moral refinement does not occur, these most brutal forces will determine the course of development. This outcome is described as comparable to the catastrophe through water that once ended the Atlantean epoch.